Frida will be here next week.
Okay, so we're on
Yep.
flip-flop here, folks.
Yes.
Late dad here, Raul with us on other voices of people of color in
Yep.
Detroit. We often think that Detroit is, well, it gets billed as black and white, but
Yep.
Detroit is obviously, when I was born, it was the fourth largest city in the country,
Yep.
meaning that there were a lot more people groups than just black and white. And so next week, then Frida will be with us.
Yep.
And then the final week will be the school to prison pipeline with
Yep.
you and who else?
Hannah King.
And Hannah King. Okay,
Yep.
so that's the next 3 weeks.
Yep.
And Raul, it's great to see you. How do you like our new parish hall? Okay, good. Would you like a donut?
I absolutely would if you can make that happen. I mean, it's Sunday, right? Miracles happen on Sunday.
In the water and wine, we're working on the donuts across time too.
All right, cool. You are good to start, Raul.
Good morning. Good morning. As Des said, my name is Raul, R-A-U-L. The accent goes over the U. I always use that as my introduction because as a child in the Chicago public school system, I went most of my life being called Raul because it's spelled like Paul, but without the accent over the U, you sort of get a different identity. And that sort of reflected a lot of my childhood and early adulthood, in terms of identity crisis. And so only in the last 5 years or 10 years have I reclaimed the accent over the U. And although I don't get really upset, I really want people to know that there's an accent there to call me Raul as opposed to Raul, because I've come to believe that identity matters and who you are matters, and folk ought to take note of that. Echeverria is my last name. I'm Puerto Rican, born and raised in Chicago, northwest side of Chicago, on a historic Humble Park, Puerto Rican community called Humble Park. My parents migrated there in the late 60s, early 70s, in search of work opportunities, and that is where I was born. I've been living in Southeast Michigan for the last 8 years, not in Detroit proper, but in a downriver city called Wyandotte. I think it's important for folk to know that I view the world, that I believe that Puerto Rico is a colony of the United States. And as a colony of the United States, as a Puerto Rican, I am a colonized subject. Seeking liberation. And that liberation for me is centered on three rungs of a ladder, if you will: a philosophy of liberation, a politics of liberation, and a theology of liberation. I have over 20 years doing community development work, mostly in Chicago, but also in the last 8 years in the both very Hispanic Latino community of Southwest Detroit, but also very diverse because there's so many other people groups that are also living in Southwest Detroit. And so when we think about the Black-white binary, especially in dominant conversations in Detroit or in the Metro Detroit area, I think it's important to note that Southwest Detroit is one of the most multicultural and diverse communities in the area, and we ought to make sure that we account for that. I personally have been serving God since 1996 when I had a conversion experience. Currently, I'm a program manager at Michigan Community Resources, just started that gig in September. I'm also a MDiv student working on my master's in divinity at Ecumenical Theological Seminary in Detroit on Woodward Avenue. And I am an adjunct professor at the University of Detroit Mercy in their School of Architecture and Community Development, where I teach a social justice course and I advise capstone project students. So that's a little bit about who I am. And I've asked Des to give me sort of the 10-minute warning because I want to wrap up and make sure I leave a little bit of time for question and answer or reflection And then I have to dip over to a church meeting. So I'm sort of on loan from Love Rising Community Church, which is where I am serving my seminary sort of field education. And that's the last bit of work I have left to do before I graduate. God willing, it will happen in the summer of 2022. So today I want to talk about engaging racial justice through a multicultural lens. And if we really want to do that kind of work, then I think it's imperative, important that we begin with self. We begin with the individual I. We have a worldview. We have an existing lens by which we view the world, whether we know it or not, or whether we understand what that is or not. It is. That's not an opinion, it is a statement of fact. We have been, our worldview has been shaped by our society, by folk around us, by a plethora of things. And we ought to note that. And that how we've been conditioned, how we've been shaped, how our worldview has been shaped, has an influence and an impact on how we view justice. Rather, how we view injustice, because to talk about justice is to note that there is an injustice. And our ability to see that injustice and to be part of correcting injustices is influenced and impacted by our worldview. And so we ought to take note of that. I'm sorry, I'm looking at my notes. Part of that worldview also includes, some positive, it's not a value statement against that, right? It's just the truth. We've been conditioned, we've been shaped, we've been influenced. The question for me, there's some positive attributes of that conditioning. There's some potentially negative attributes, right? There's some positive values that have been handed over to us. But there's probably also some biases and some blind spots as it relates to race in this country. So unpacking that is the first step. Unpacking that is the first step towards doing racial justice work. And not only sort of in the black-white binary, but also in the multicultural field, because there's a host of other blind spots there that we may not know because we're so entrenched in this area, in this metro area, around issues of black-white relations. And so the first thing I tell folk to do, the first step I tell folk to do that self-work, right? That unpacking work of how we have sort of, how our worldview has been developed and has been shaped is to answer three sort of prompts. And those are who you're from, where you're from, and when you're from. Who you're from, where you're from, and when you're from. Those are three, I think, critical areas that we have to engage in examining ourselves to understand how our worldview has been shaped. Who you're from is who are your people, right? Who are your kinfolk? Who are the networks of support that have accompanied us on life's journey? And that can, the answer to that can be family, it can be friends, it can be national ethnic communities or groups, it can be racial groups, but all of those different groups have all impacted and have shaped your worldview and the lens by which we view the world. And so in order to unpack that, in order to sort of sort through what is good and what is not so good, we have to know who has been part of our journey and has impacted and shaped our worldview. The second is where we're from. Geography matters. And we don't always think about that in our society. We sort of universalize principles and we take them out of context. And we don't realize that perhaps living in Central Texas, you might develop a worldview that's different than living in Manhattan, New York City, right? That where you're from has also an influence and an impact on how you view the world. But also, say if we go back to Central Texas and we say suburbia versus urban, that also influences and shapes our worldview and the lens by which we view the world, and how we can actually see or not see injustice. And so where you're from, geography, context matters, and we need to unpack that. And again, I'm not making value statements at all. I'm saying we need to take note of these things. We don't often do this introspective analysis. But then it when we don't do that and we try to engage in actions of justice, we mess things up sometimes, because we have good intentions, but we haven't unpacked how we're viewing the world. And for a person of color, for someone of an oppressed group, I can't live with good intentions. Like, I can't live with my bads. Like, sometimes my bads have astronomical consequences for me and for my people. And so I love that people are trying, and I love that there's intention, but this internal work is deeply important so that you can limit how many my bads, how many accidents, how many mistakes you make or we make in this work of rectifying injustice. The last one is when we're from, right? Time matters. People matter, geography, context matter, and time matters. Growing up in Humboldt Park, Chicago in the 1980s and early 90s is certainly different than growing up in the 2010s. I know that every time I drive to my old neighborhood and see how much it's changed, how much the demography has changed, the culture has changed. And so time matters. When did you grow up there? When were your people influencing? What time of the year? What was going on sociologically in your neighborhood, in your city, in your state, and in the country, right? All of that shapes and influences how we view the world. Now, once we uncover our worldview, once we do that internal work and we sort of spend time analyzing, reflecting, sort of maybe even listing things out, right? Creating lists and annotating sort of all of those answers to all of those questions and reflections. Then we can go into a process where we can say, I think that this is valuable and I'm going to keep that. This is not so valuable, I'm not going to keep that. We can sort of do that sorting process so that our worldview at the end of this process is something that you have chosen intentionally. You have chosen with purpose, that it has not been left to sort of social conditioning or has not been left to chance, but that you are now sort of purposely saying, this is a value and I'm going to keep. This is a value of my childhood. This is a value from my family, from whomever, from whatever the geography that influence you. I'm going to keep these things. But then there might be some things you might say, you know, this is ugly. This is not nice. This is not the person I want to be. And I can say, I'm going to get rid of that. And so you can start doing that sorting process and start to intentionally choose your lens or intentionally choose your worldview. And again, I stress this is our work. If we want to jump into issues of injustice, then this is work we all have to do. And it's not limited to sort of people in the dominant culture. I have had to know what I bring to the table every time I enter the room. I have had to know why I feel some kind of way when certain issues raise up. And I can't just leave it to my emotional reaction. I've got to know why I feel the way that I feel before I even enter the room or before I open my mouth. A case example would be, as I mentioned in my own introduction, I view the world as a colonized subject of the United States. I believe that Puerto Rico is a colony. And that affects, that part of my identity, my worldview affects when I hear the national anthem. right? And when I don't want to stand up, and you all should know I don't stand up, but I have to know why I feel that way, instead of just being defiant without understanding. I have to know and understand why I can't believe that some of the values of the United States narrative about freedom and justice for all is to be taken seriously, because the people of Puerto Rico have been colonized subjects of the United States since 1898, after the Spanish-American War, when Spain, as a result of the peace treaty, ceded Puerto Rico to the United States as war booty, as treasure from the end of the war. And I have to understand that, because U.S. citizenship was not something that our people fought for to have. It was not a justice issue for us. We wanted to be independent. Instead, in 1917, the United States Congress imposed U.S. citizenship on all Puerto Ricans living in the islands and living in the U.S. So I say all of that to say, like, that makes me feel some kind of way when I enter a room living and working in the United States. And I have to understand that gut feeling that I feel when something is rubbing me the wrong way. I have to understand why that is, and not just act out of pure emotion or pure repression of my emotion, right? I have to know why I feel the way I do, so that I can enter the spaces soberly. So again, this is not limited to sort of white folk doing their work. This is all our work that we have to do. I believe that we all have to unpack how we've been shaped, how our worldviews have been shaped, and then choose the values and choose the elements on purpose, intentionally, as opposed to sort of, I feel this way because that's how I was raised. Which again, does not really allow us to enter into issues of justice equitably. So once we embark on our work, right, who we're from, when we're from, where we're from, then we begin to pivot our center. That is to say, humans, just by way of our sort of the development of our brain and our separation from the rest of created things, have a tendency to view the world through a center, right? My life is the center of the universe and everything else revolves around it. I mean, that's very narcissistic, but it's also very subtly how we tend to view things. We tend to center our way of seeing things and universalize them. And we sort of assume that that's how everybody believes, that's what everybody thinks. Again, we don't really think about how geography, how kinship, and how time influences how we see the world. We just assume everybody sees it that way. That's our natural tendency to center ourselves in the world. And if you want to look at issues of injustice, you have to practice decentering or pivoting your center. It's not to say you lessen yourself or lessen your worldview. You sort of take a pivot, right? Your worldview is still there, it's still important, but you're pivoting to try to see from a different vantage point. You're looking at the same situation and you're trying to see from a different vantage point. And part of that pivot is to look at, to view the situations from the margins, to take a view from the margin and not the center, to sort of say, what is the perspective of the oppressed people in this situation? What is the perspective of the injured people of this situation? What is the perspective of those who are experiencing injustice? They may not be the same as me or the same as my worldview. And so it's an attempt, limited as it is, because we can never know what another people group are feeling, right? Unless we're actually experiencing it ourselves. But nevertheless, it's important to try to see it through other people's eyes, through other people's lenses. We have to listen to the voices of those who are experiencing the injustice, and not just listen to their voices, but believe them. We have to listen and believe what they're telling us, right? A good example is the issue of water, the tainted water in Flint. For a good time, the people were saying there's something wrong with the water. And all of the people that are paid to sort of be the experts or paid to sort of be the caretakers of that society, of that city, of that state, including the governor, they were sort of saying, we hear you, but there's nothing, our data doesn't tell us that there's anything wrong with the water. And of course, it took some activists working with some university students, university leaders to actually do the testing and uncover what the people already intuitively were saying. There's something wrong with the water. So we have to engage in a practice of listening and believing. And then this point I can't understate, we have to follow their lead. Too many times when we're doing social justice work, we feel so indignant about the situation that we want to do something about it. And we want to utilize our faculty as an individual, but also our resources of our privilege to actually engage in righting the wrongs. And that's all well and good, but you ought not lead those struggles. You ought to let folk who are experiencing take the lead, and then you follow them. You follow them with your resources. You follow them with your energy and your anger and your indignation. You follow the lead of those folk who are experiencing the problem. And the reason why this is really important is because, as I've said, it's impossible if you are not part of the injured group to really understand what the injustice feels like. And we're doing this internal work, but we might be at different levels of that work. And we might, by taking the lead, go a wrong way or do some more injury or some more harm, or mute voices that need to be the loudest because we sort of have access to resources and we have levels of privilege and we're mad and we want to do something about it. That phrase, the road to hell is paved with good intentions, has a role to play in what I'm saying, because there are a lot of those kind of roads in this work of justice work. And the people that suffer the most are the people who are already suffering. And so follow the lead of those who are experiencing, but follow with your resources, follow with your energy and your time, follow with your indignation. And then lastly, be a mirror. Be a mirror to those who are wronged, who are oppressed. In other words, this is what I hear you saying. This is what I see you suffering. Am I right? Is this right? Sort of be reflective for folk. That is so important. I think that too many times we think we're doing work that is righteous, and sometimes we need someone to be as objective as possible and give us some positive feedback, and so, or negative critical feedback for sure. So be a mirror to folk, and then seek mirrors of folk. Find people, particularly people who are not part of your tribe, particularly people who are not part of your who, where, and when. Seek those folk to be a mirror to you as you're doing this work, right? And I have relationships in Southwest Detroit where I go to them, white folk who are lifelong Detroiters, where I go to them and sort of say, hey, this is what I'm thinking. Am I off base? Am I wrong? Should I slow down? Should I move without people, right? Should I lead in this case, or should I follow? And I try not to move without having sought my mirrors. And so, but this is a reciprocal relationship, right? So in as much I value people being a mirror to me and shouldering that work on my behalf, I have to be available to them and to others and be reflective for them. And so be a mirror, seek a mirror. And so those are sort of some initial steps, I think, that then will allow us to see injustices, not just through racial lenses, but through a multicultural lens. Lastly, I'll leave you with one example. The issue of immigration in this country is seen as a border issue and seen as a Mexican United States issue. And in 1848, after the Treaty of Hidalgo, where the northern half of Mexico proper was ceded over to the United States and became part of the United States mainland, all of a sudden, Mexican nationals became US nationals. So this question about borders and people crossing the borders is a problematic one, because we can talk about the actual fact of people crossing borders, but there are people who didn't do anything and the border shifted on them. And the United States historically did not deal well with them as it related to their land, to their property. And so this question of immigration can't just be viewed as a border issue. It has to be viewed as a justice issue, as a human rights issue. What do you do when the border shifts on you? And how does that affect you? Or how does it affect when your kinfolk now are on the other side of the border and you're on the northern side? Those are real issues that I think we ought to sort of try to pivot our center, listen to those voices to better understand the situation before we sort of allow our own social conditioning to provoke us to take action. That's all I got. I know I was talking fast. There was a lot of information there. I can do some slides and share them with Des, and she can share them with you. I didn't want to do slides because I wanted to see people and I wanted people to see me. But I have some time for some questions or reflections people might have. Des, if people are talking, I can't hear anything, so. There's no,
to get your
Can you mute yourself for a half second, Raul?
Yep.
Thanks. Okay. Okay. Hold on, we're gonna figure this out. We're gonna figure it out. No, we would want to hear your question. Yep.
I don't know.
Oh, that's okay.
All right. What
I'm
I've
not sure.
been witnessing, I've had a wonderful career and I've really enjoyed being a first generation American. But for the first time, I have become afraid. And that's what we can talk about Puerto Ricans and Indians and a whole bunch of people. But isn't it true that we have to sit back now and begin to realize the kind of changes that are not subtle, they're frightening. And how does one deal with that in a country that we had on a pedestal? You know, when we, in my father's generation, it was to go to England and Oxford and all of that. My generation, my brother and I, we wanted to and taught the world of America, and that's where we came. But for the first time, with what has happened in the past two or 3 years, certainly with January the 6th, has brought a different nuance to being a brown-skinned foreign person. And I wondered if we have to move from some of the old ideas into how do we really face what is happening when we're very frightened for the first time. I don't know if I'm making sense or I've gone off on a tangent, but I think the challenges of color and other things is different now.
Thank you. I think that aside from sort of that individual work that I mentioned earlier, I mean, I think that you're right that in that same moment, there are some things that are going on that are also provoking us to sort of have a sense of urgency about us. And I think that the way that I view today's context is that the use of mutual aid networks, the rediscovering the notion of solidarity work, and even the idea of sanctuary by churches and other houses of worship, right? Other faith traditions, I think become really important in this time, because we don't know, the energy is charged and people are feeling unsafe. And we need now more than ever to have sort of networks that are active around justice and solidarity, but also providing safe places for people to both talk about the issues, but also really physically to be in a safe environment. I think those things all become critical in this moment for sure. And unfortunately, I think that it's also part of where we see the United States today, globally and just politically, right? It's sort of like the veneers being peeled off. The veil is being lifted off of the facade, and people are seeing the ugly truth about up against the rhetoric of, sort of freedom and justice. And that was very evident with the previous administration, presidential administration. So I think that all of that really creates for highly charged political times, and I think we ought to all think about how do we provide safety and security for people of color, and that's not just work for people of color. That's also white folk work. In terms of thinking about their solidarity and thinking about how can they be real allies with Black and Brown folk in this country.
In whatever with what you were saying, do you think that what you are feeling right now, a reaction to things that are being said and done, do you think those things have just been covert throughout forever in this country, and they've just been vocalizing them more recently? Just like being an African American, we've always dealt with this issue, but a lot of the things were covert. They weren't out in the open. I think people feel more free to let their nastiness and ugliness spew because it's all right to do so. It's nothing new. I think you're just hearing what we've heard for a long time. You know what I mean? And like you said, it's where you're from, who you're from, and when you're from. You may have experienced great progress and everything coming to this country. You came and got a good education and probably a good profession where, say, a lot of African Americans were not able to do that. So you were from India, but you were probably considered a little bit better than, say, an African American in this country. I know that sounds wild, but perhaps Raul understands also. Exactly, but I think you're just hearing things that are frightening you that have been going on all along. People just didn't say it out loud.
Well,
And now they're doing so because it's all right to do so.
and I think that last part of your statement is the key. I think that there is a level of boldness today that we hadn't seen in this country in a very long time, and that boldness, I believe, stems from sort of an innate, unspoken, perhaps, angst that people embedded in white superiority, white supremacy, are feeling as the demographics are shifting in this country. And as the United States global position is shifting geopolitically, I think that that all of these things are coming together in a moment, in a historic juncture, where it's becoming more brazen and more bold, and I think therefore more dangerous, right? I think that to utilize some theory around domestic violence, intimate partner violence, the most dangerous time for particularly a woman, it isn't always a woman, but particularly the most dangerous time for a person in a bad, violent relationship is when they're ready to leave. That is the most dangerous time for that person. So long as they're enduring things, and so long as they're willing to stay in that situation, they'll get beaten to the point of their life, but they won't die. But most of the times happen when there's a death, is when the person is ready to leave. And I say that to illustrate sort of what's happening in the United States. The white community is slowly but surely not going to be the dominant category in the demographic category in the United States. That has a psychological feeling on people who have felt superior, or systems that have felt superior for a long time. And again, that makes people feel a kind of way, sometimes without even knowing why. This is why I stress doing that work. Sometimes we don't know why we're feeling the way we're feeling. For me, there's a beauty in this moment, because it's an opportunity for a real diverse group of people to define what the United States of America can be and will be. It's an opportunity to dismantle sort of the structures of white supremacy and white superiority, and really make a multi-ethnic, multi-cultural country, not just in rhetoric, but in reality, especially as people, Black, brown, people of color, begin to resist some of the oppression, and begin to say, we live here and we want to be part of shaping what this looks like.
Okay.
I was born in New Orleans, but I was raised in Saginaw. And I remember my mother always said, if you go to the grocery store and the owner, we had grocery stores at that time, and the owner was white, she said, don't let her call you whatever that derogatory name was that I was doing in college. She said, always tell her, my name is Lorraine. And when I came to Detroit, we were looking for homes along the 8 Mile Wyoming area. Naively, we just knocked on doors, trying to find a place. And every time we went to a door, they had just rented that area. So we ended up on Dawson, but it was a very nice apartment. So I find it trying to say that even though it was very, very subtle, I have experienced that. And when I went to college at Central Michigan, I was babysitting for my sociology teacher. And I think he wanted his children to know Black people. And I remember this little boy said, when I first met him, he said, "Are you dirty?" And I explained to him that that was my color, which I thought was very naive because he had never met a Black person before. And also in Mount Pleasant, um, when I was walking, um, this little boy said, um, what did he call it? But it was the things that I remember were very naive because I just meant that they had never seen. Oh, he said, "Mommy, look, a gingerbread lady," which meant to me he had never seen a person of color. But it wasn't negative. It was just his reaction. So um, I have experienced the good and bad of these. Thank you.
Thank you. Unfortunately, I'm going to have to run because I've got that church meeting, but thank you all for the space. Thank you for listening and even reflecting with me. I think that's really important for me personally. I just want to also just talk a little bit briefly about the Casita project that we had the ribbon cutting, just to clarify a little bit. Basically, folkloric houses are set up historically in Puerto Rican cities or Puerto Rican neighborhoods, communities, mostly in New York, but also Philadelphia and Chicago, as a place for Puerto Ricans to practice their culture, to preserve their culture, and to be people of diaspora, right? To sort of create a sense of home away from home. And that is exactly what we were able to do in Southwest Detroit, is create that kind of a space. But the way I call for it is the name of the space is called La Casita, which means the little house. Cimarron y Yuquetí. And cimarron is a Spanish term for the anglicized word is maroon. And basically, maroons were formerly enslaved Black bodies that escaped the capitalist colonial enterprise and built their own communities out in the wilderness, mostly in the mountains. It was a free community of free people. And normally they joined up with the indigenous folk and they built community in the wilderness, hunter-gatherer folk. They did some agriculture, but not a lot. But basically, it was people who withdrew from the dominant economic system of oppression and built alternative communities. And sometimes even Creole white Euro folk also joined those communities. They said, I don't believe in this anymore, and I'm going to join up with those maroon people. And that's kind of the symbolism behind the Casita in Detroit, is that sort of this is a free space, a piece for freedom-loving people, people looking to escape the conditions of oppression and looking to practice and engage in freedom. And so that's kind of how we envision that space. And so I was excited to finally do the ribbon cutting, and I'm excited to continuing to sort of program that space and let it be what I think it was meant to be. So thank you all for the space and time. I appreciate it. Continue to do that personal work. Continue to seek out, love justice, and do that work with God and with the power of the Spirit. And I will talk to you soon, God willing.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. Do you want me to
Des, do
stop
you have any
recording?
concluding words for us?
All right. And for us to be able to learn about the experiences and the injustice and the struggles that our different communities are sharing and experiencing in that, because what we are seeing is we're seeing a rise of white folks moving into the city of Detroit. And we're also seeing a shift of Black and brown bodies coming out of Detroit into suburban spaces in that. And so that creates a tension in that, and that tension creates an opportunity to learn. And so with what Raul shared, and then it's an opportunity for us to really think about and be able to embrace that. As he mentioned, we're all in different phases and different journeys of working together and creating understanding and building understanding. I know Father Chris has talked about this journey that y'all have been on around addressing that indifference. And for some folks that's because we are learning to reconnect our emotions and reconnect to our space and that, because as a person who identifies as white, I know that systemically and through history and that looking at through time, there's been very intentional work to have white people and white bodies to disconnect from their emotions in order to justify harms done to non-white folks or into Black and brown bodies, and that in ways to justify how we can create that hierarchy that a couple of y'all mentioned earlier. And that when we look at this country, we think about that it's been built on this premise of anti-Blackness, but it also comes with layers. And we've had folks who are experiencing different levels, who have some, who experience it in silence, in an effort to be able to try and achieve what we're all looking for, which is acceptance, welcoming, and opportunity. And so when we think about all of our shared, our individual histories and our shared histories, and we think about the context of the United States, and that we have so much to learn and we have so much to reconnect too. And that, so if there's questions, apparently I'm missing all the cues. I'm sorry, Steve. But if, so yeah, if there's any questions or to talk further in that, I'm definitely here. I don't have all the answers and that, but we are in a shared space in that. So there are answers in this space as a collective and that we can build off of. And that when we build these spaces, we create those opportunities to be able to dig in and add to the history, to add to the context. This exhibit just starts, about unpacking what we have done systemically as a country. And so we have the opportunity to be able to build and unpack that as individuals, and then what we want it to look like systemically moving forward. And that's so.
Great. Well, Des, thank you very much, and you'll be here for a little bit.
I will be here.
Great.
Yep.
By all means, do so, and we'll see you soon. Thanks again.
All right, thank you.